Welcome to Superhumanize. I'm Ariana Summer, your host, and my guest today is a woman who listens to stone the way others listen to music, hearing the layered rhythms, ancient memory, and hidden messages beneath our feet. Dr. Marcia Bjornerud is a structural geologist, writer, and professor at Lawrence University, whose work explores the physics of earthquakes, the architecture of mountains, and the deep time story of our living planet. She's the author of several beloved books for popular audiences, including Reading the Rocks, Timefulness, Geopedia, and most recently, Turning to Stone, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of Rocks, which won the 2025 John Burroughs Medal for Natural History Writing. In today's conversation, we explore Earth as an animate, dynamic system, one that has been reinventing itself for 4 billion years, leaving records of her great experiments in stone. We dive into Marcia's life's work of decoding that record and into her belief that rocks are not inert. They are narrators of Earth's evolving story. Marcia invites us to understand the language of stone, to foster a geo-centric worldview that reconnects us with the rhythms and relationships of this planet, and to step into a deeper kinship with the Earth as home. We also speak about her travels to remote parts of the world, such as Svalbard, Norway, her reflections on the Anthropocene, how thinking like a geologist can help save the world, and what she may have learned from indigenous wisdom traditions in her dialogue with land and rock. This is a conversation about time, transformation, and the quiet, enduring truths that live in stone.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Marcia, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. What a pleasure to connect with you.
Likewise, Ariana.
I was so fascinated when I learned about you and your work, and it really touched something in my core. I've always felt such kinship with Earth, and what you do and what you put forth into this world is so much more than quote unquote science. And even that is, your work is profound. If you could place your hand on a stone that represents the beginning of your path, what kind of rock would it be? And what might it whisper to us listening about you?
I've known so many rocks and been such good company throughout my life. But I do think that some early experiences puzzling over cobbles that were in a gravel pit near the place I grew up in northwestern Wisconsin, probably early glimpses that there was a secret world that was surrounding us and yet would require some kind of key to unlock what it was saying. And so some of the rock type would be a basalt that was coming from the shores of Lake Superior and were delivered to where I grew up by the glaciers. And it wouldn't be until years later that I was able to read the cryptic messages in those cobbles.
Marcia, your work intertwines so much of the universal via science, but also the outlook on this beautiful planet that we all share with the personal. That's something that's really touched me. And your latest book is both a memoir and also a meditation on Earth's history. And each chapter centers on a specific rock. That's why I also just asked you to perhaps introduce yourself with what type of rock would be one that comes to mind at the beginning of your story and of your connection with rocks. What inspired you to structure the book in this way? And what do each of these rocks, if you are willing to give us a brief synopsis, reveal about the chapters of your own life?
I have written several earlier books, and with this recent one, I really wanted to take readers deeper into the nuances of the way the Earth works. And I had a couple of false starts. Each time the result seemed too much like a textbook. And I realized finally, somewhat reluctantly, that I could use my own small human story, provide the narrative arc for what I really wanted to share with readers, which was this sense of what a creative, resilient, strange planet we live on. And so my own story of accidentally coming into the geosciences as someone who never even thought of myself as a science type, and then the development of my own understanding at the same time that the field itself was changing dramatically the last, say, 30 or more years. I realized that I could tell these entangled stories, my own story, the story of the science, and the story of the Earth itself, by highlighting particular rocks that were protagonists in my own life at different times.
Yes, and it's a beautiful structure. And again, you weave together the deeply personal with the universal. You also coined the term timefulness. Can you share what it means and also how cultivating this mindset may shift how we live, relate, and lead in the present?
Yeah. So, what I mean by timefulness is really the distinctive worldview of geology. I, Let me say first that I think in many people's minds, geology is just about rock and mineral identification or classification. And I think to practicing geoscientists, it's really a way of seeing. And it means seeing in 4 dimensions, including time, understanding that there are many versions of the world that are in some ways still with us. We are embedded in the products of time. So timefulness is this habit of seeing, I sometimes say in a polytemporal way, that I can look out on a landscape and see it as it is now, but realize that there are vestiges of earlier versions of this place that can still be read. One analogy that I sometimes use is borrowed from medieval studies, and it's the idea of a palimpsest text, which would have been a parchment that was written on and then scraped off and re-inked, because parchment was really a laborious thing to create. You wouldn't just throw it away. And so many ancient texts survive only as the vestigial writing beneath more recent inscriptions. And that's a good metaphor for the way geologists see a landscape, that it's this palimpsest that's been written and partially erased many times over. And thinking geologically is learning to read those vestiges of earlier
Yes.
writing.
Yes, and I think that also, in a sense, you can apply that to us human beings, because what we see now, you have the vestiges of so many other selves as we transform, as we transmute and alchemize and are constantly becoming. You also write that the Earth has been reinventing herself for over 4 billion years. And as you just said, also when you look at a landscape, one thing, but there's vestiges of so many other things. And Earth is, if you so want to say, basically keeping a record of her experiments, of her becoming in the form of rocks. Could you walk us through some of this record and also share with us what these ancient stones tell us about our beautiful planet's creativity and also resilience?
Wow, where to start? Every single stone came into being. They're objects that have biographies. I sometimes say that rocks shouldn't be viewed as nouns, but verbs, because they're records of events. And in fact, they're still changing. A rock that may be at the surface today may have been formed or deformed deep into the surface. And as it's experiencing new environments, it's interacting with the modern atmosphere and becoming something different. So rocks are really, in some sense, animate. In my field, which is structural geology, it has to do with tectonics and mountain building. We routinely think of rocks as flowing in the solid state very slowly. They're deforming, they're changing their shape, they're moving as the plates move. So every stone is a memory of some earlier version of the place where it is. And that place might have been at a different location when the stone formed even. Here in the mid-continent, we have some really truly ancient rocks. The bedrock of parts of Wisconsin, where I'm from, is up to 3 billion years old. And there's lots that can happen in 3 billion years. In contrast, California is a young area. Most of its rocks are younger than about 200 million years old. So different places have archives of different lengths. And it's really a very complex thing to be able to, again, hold in the mind's eye the different stories from different places from across time.
And Marcia, you have mentioned that your career has also coincided with a particularly transformative era in the geosciences. And I'm wondering, what is it like for you to witness Earth's history unfold at the same time as these new understandings about her coming through?
Yeah, I feel really lucky to have come into the field in this kind of time of new analytical methods, monitoring from space of the Earth, and new conceptual paradigms all converging in the late 20th century and early 21st century to allow us for the first time to really have a comprehensive top-down view of the Earth over time. So some of those big conceptual changes that I've seen since I was an undergraduate would include the maturation of understanding plate tectonics, which is remarkably recent. We didn't know how the solid Earth worked until the mid 1960s, and it really took a couple of decades to be able to quantify and understand tectonic processes, and we're still learning. The whole study of climate was in a really primitive state when I was in college, and that has become a very sophisticated field. We've learned to read the records of past climate from ice cores and sea sediments, and we have sophisticated computer models that can process huge amounts of data and simulate climate into the future. We have a new understanding of how rocks and water and the atmosphere interact in these great biogeochemical cycles. That was not a field that even existed when I was a student. So again, I feel fortunate to have had the kind of insider's view of this changing understanding of the Earth. And I think a growing sense of humility among scientists at the complexity of it all.
And Marcia, I'm curious because so much has changed in the last 2 or 3 decades, and a very different kind of understanding has also emerged with regard to the Earth. What are some of the beliefs that had been held for a long time that have basically been rectified or dismantled in the recent past? What is something that 100 years ago human beings would have absolutely believed about the Earth, and where now we know ain't so?
There are a lot. First of all, again, as I said, plate tectonics, which is very fundamental to the way the Earth functions, wasn't recognized until a lifetime. And so 100 years ago, people believed the continents were fixed in place, that they didn't move, and there was no good explanation for how mountains grew, because it's hard to explain how you crunch rocks together if everything is rooted in place. So we really just did not have any unified understanding of phenomena like earthquakes, mountain building, or volcanism until the mid 60s, early 70s. That's shocking. And just let me say, in geology's defense, it was because Earth is big and complicated. And we didn't have the tools until that fairly recently to be able to develop this top-down view. Certainly another huge paradigm shift has been the acceptance that sometimes bad things happen to good planets. Geology began in the early 1800s with the orthodox view that all geologic change was slow. This was because prior to early geological thinking in Britain in the 1800s, people would look to the Bible for explanations for how things came to be. And more often, things were explained as a result of Noah's flood. And so geologists, as they began to understand the rock record, had to push back against that and became rather maybe too emphatic about the idea that all geologic change is slow and that things like the Grand Canyon can be formed very slowly and incrementally by erosion. And in the main, that's true. But it caused geologists to reject out of hand the idea that there could be large magnitude catastrophic things that can happen. that would change the Earth quickly. And I think the thing that broke that paradigm was finally the discovery that the dinosaur extinction event was probably caused by a meteorite impact, which is now mainstream in the public's mind too. And then that allowed geologists to propose with good evidence that there are things in the geologic record that are best explained by unusual catastrophic causes.
And what comes to mind, and please fill in my blanks, it's at the tip of my tongue, but I believe about 12,000 years ago or so, there are indications that there was a catastrophic event, a great flood. The period is called, is it the late Dryas or?
The late Dryas actually was a time of a brief return to cold conditions in the late Ice Age. Yeah, in which there certainly were giant late Ice Age floods, most notoriously in what is now Eastern Washington State, an area that's called the Channeled Scablands, probably a flood, probably a volume of water, the equivalent of Lake Michigan, was released in maybe a week and carved out this very strange landscape in Eastern Washington and large parts of what is now the Columbia River Gorge.
Right. And are there any indications from your knowledge, Marcia, that similar things happened in other locations around the globe around the same time period?
Yeah, in probably the English Channel might have been carved really catastrophically when a previously ice-dammed water body suddenly was unleashed. Yeah, any time that we go to a new climate regime, there will be lots of instability and a readjustment to the new circumstances, and large magnitude things can happen. And that's a sobering lesson for us as we change the climate rather rapidly today.
Indeed. And the reason why I asked is because I've been fascinated with some theories of different individuals, some scientists, some researchers, such as Graham Hancock, who also ties this particular period that we're right now touching upon with massive changes in humanity, that there may have been cultures that are now forgotten. Others say that this massive shift and then a shift to scarcity survival basically also uprooted entire systems. For example, systems that were more matrilineal and where women played much more of a leadership role. And then with the advancement of agriculture, a lot changed. So that's why I was just curious to listen to you from your perspective. There's something else that pops spontaneously into my head. What are your thoughts on what individuals who identify as flat earthers say?
Do they dare get in an airplane because the trajectory of their flights are completely predicated on the fact that the Earth is spherical? It's breathtaking to me that, yeah, I don't even know what to say. We can see the Earth from space today. So we don't need to make inferences, and there's just so many easily observed facts. I'm sorry, I don't even have the words.
That's perfectly all right. And this was a very spontaneous question. I was just thinking to myself, there's a lot of people who are quite smart in other ways, but then they latch on to something like that.
Yeah, and I guess I shouldn't be so dismissive. To me, it's symptomatic, I think, of the failure of science education, maybe, where people want to be able to look at things in their own way and make inferences. And it's symptomatic, think of people being told too often that they can't trust their own powers of observation. And so it's really incumbent on those of us who teach science, both in formal and informal settings, to make sure that we're explaining the epistemology. How do we know what we know? What is the evidence that leads us to assert these things that might not initially be obvious? And so I think that if you peel back the layers, it's about the tragic modern disconnection that people feel between their small human experiences and what's going on in the noisy technosphere.
That is so true. And this is also why the work that individuals like you do and sharing your vast knowledge in ways that a regular person like me can actually understand and enjoy, such as via your books, is so important. And what you have right now mentioned, I think, also so crucial, the feeling of feeling so small in our human experience existence and looking at the great all. And in your journeys, you've traveled to very remote parts of the world. You've also witnessed firsthand Earth not as a static backdrop, but as a living, breathing, and transforming system. I love what you also shared a little while ago about rocks and that you see them like they flow. It's just in a different at a different time or speed than us humans. How has experiencing and witnessing all this shaped your relationship with the planet as and from your humanity?
It has profoundly. I can't anymore separate my work and my thinking as a geoscientist from my human experience of being alive, for better or worse. And I think that's a strange thing about the geosciences, that they become really grafted onto the people who practice them over time. I feel that I have relationships, again, maybe unrequited, with rocks that I've gotten to know and that I've been in conversation with, at least in my mind, for long periods of time, sometimes understanding what they're saying and sometimes being frustrated that they're not speaking clearly to me. And as you mentioned, I've been lucky to work in some remote places, including the high Arctic regions of Norway and Canada, and have seen firsthand how quickly, even by human standards, landscapes, especially in those places, can change with climate change. And that's been really sobering. When I first started working in Svalbard in Arctic Norway in the 1980s, it still felt like the ice age. The glaciers were pretty healthy, and the sea ice was really the thing that limited how early we could get into the field in the summertime. And just 25 or 30 years later, it's a completely changed landscape. The rates of geologic change are just breathtaking to me. I'm seeing geology unfolding in real time in somewhat alarming ways. Yeah, I didn't realize at the outset of my career how profoundly the science would really shape my spiritual outlook.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that. And what you just said resonates with me so much. Maybe my way of communication with rocks or crystals is not the same as yours, but I also feel like I have a relationship with them and I feel like there is some kind of an exchange. I have multiple altars around my home on the outside with rocks and rock gardens. I keep altars in my house. I usually have some kind of a rock or a stone or a crystal with me in my handbag. And when friends travel to fascinating places that I haven't been to yet, or that I may not be able to get to, one friend of mine, she's an investigative journalist, and she traveled to Syria. She traveled to Iraq, and she's always so sweet. She always asks me, "Can I bring you something?" I'm like, "Yes, please bring me a rock from a place that resonated with you." So I have all these different types of rocks also on my bookshelves at home, and I love it. And I love that you emphasize that rocks are not inert and that they are narrators of a long and complex planetary story. And so, for those listening, what does it mean to learn the language of stone? And how can we begin to interpret the wisdom in the landscapes around us?
Different rocks speak very different languages or dialects. Sedimentary rocks, which are maybe the most familiar, are good sources of information about past conditions at the surface of the earth. That's where they formed, and that's where their memories will lie. And they're relatively easy to read. We can understand a sandstone as having perhaps been deposited on a beach or maybe in a desert. And different attributes can help us understand which of those is the real origin. Other rocks are a little more cryptic, those that formed deep underground, or my favorites are the metamorphic rocks, which were born in one environment and then through tectonics or burial found themselves in a completely different place and had to respond and often recrystallize into very different forms. And so they have at least two stories to tell, their origin story and then their travels and what they experienced. And then of course they had to make it back to the surface for us to find them again. So I think that I use a lot of text and language analogies, but I think they're actually quite apt, that each rock type has its own sort of idiom. And little by little, we can learn to understand those. And one of the joys of becoming a geologist is that although there are lots of rock languages, they are also global. So I could go anywhere in the world and the rocks are speaking the same languages. I might not understand the human cultures in those places, but I do understand the rocks' cultures.
Yeah. Yes. So probably similar to there's this, oh God, it comes in stickers, bumper stickers, something that says dogs are nicer than people, or I'd rather be with my Yorkies. So probably for sticker for you, I'd rather be with my rocks.
Exactly.
I get it. I'm a highly functioning introvert. I think I understand. So it also comes across in what you share with us, what you teach us by your books, Marcia, is you describe Earth as a dynamic and an interconnected system of rock, air, water, and light that's constantly transforming itself. On a human family spiritual scale, what do you think would happen when we, as a species, some cultures are different, but most of us, what would happen if we would start to see Earth as animate rather than mechanical?
It would be a profound shift, and it would take in Western culture. Yeah, it would be hard to achieve at this late capitalistic moment, probably. But it's a profound shift in worldview. It would instill in us a little more humility if we saw the natural world not just as the passive backdrop for our activities, but in fact, actually the director of the play that we're in. We treat nature in the West primarily as the scenery, not as a protagonist in our lives. And when it does become a protagonist in events like floods, earthquakes, then we're outraged.
Yes.
This is somehow an anomaly. And part of my message is it's not just that nature is this lovely, benign thing. It's that nature's in charge. And we have this delusion in our technological time that we're in charge. We've learned to manipulate nature in some clever but naive ways and have this, again, dangerous idea that somehow now we've outgrown nature. And I think I get frustrated even sometimes with environmental rhetoric. I'm a staunch environmentalist, but as a geoscientist, the implications that Earth is being weakened or enfeebled, I think, are the wrong message. In fact, we are unleashing powers of the climate system in particular that we haven't had to contend with in most of human civilization. In some sense, we're making the Earth system stronger because we are pushing it out of equilibrium, and there's always going to be a strong pushback.
Right.
And so that's part of my message is, hey, humans, remember that you're earthlings.
Yes.
And the earth is our home, but the earth is powerful. And we need to keep a proper sense of proportion. I have a friend here at the university who's a medievalist, and she took me to task in my book, Timefulness. I used medieval as a pejorative term, that we have medieval ideas about something. And she's enlightened me and pointed out that in many ways, although medieval people did not have the science and technology of our time, they did have probably a more enlightened understanding of their relationship with nature. Because they didn't have the luxury of the buffer of technology. Nobody in medieval times would have thought they were exempt from the laws of nature in ways that most modern people think they are. Our continued inaction on climate change is really like saying, doesn't apply to us. We don't have to care about that. or people who suggest we could go to Mars and live there happily.
I have a question about that too. Yes.
Yeah, it's a delusion. And so who's smarter?
Yes. It's not us. And what you said prior, Marcia, is so true. I am also, ever since I was a child, I have had a call to align with causes to support the environment, to help species from not going extinct, to collect signatures, save the seals. I was 7, 8 years old when I drove all the adults and all of my teachers nuts with collecting signatures for Greenpeace, etc. What even when I was little, it bothered me because it didn't make sense. I didn't have the words or the knowledge to actually put it into words, but was what you also mentioned, this idea that the earth is getting weakened, right? Save the planet. No, it's save us. The planet will be fine. If we continue this way, we will have just been a blip. Maybe yet another human blip. Maybe we've done this so many times. When are we going to learn the lesson? But this is really interesting what you pointed out about medieval people. Yes, they felt the effects right away of nature. They didn't have the buffer of technology. And I always am very wary about, for example, if you can't survive in a place without modifying the climate, for example, let's say by air conditioning, I wouldn't want to live there. I don't want to know what would happen if we would have to contend here in the US with massive blackouts, like they, for example, have been contending with in India every summer. What would happen in a city like Phoenix, Arizona, or in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we're not talking just about discomfort. We're talking about potentially life-threatening situations. And if that hits a whole urban environment, millions of people, no electricity. So that's where we'd actually feel the repercussions of what we have been exacerbating massively. And it really resonates with me what you shared about how Western culture sees Earth basically like as a backdrop for our activities, like scenery. And you've written about how rocks are not just beautiful objects, but you've shared about the hidden infrastructure that supports life. For example, from sandstone aquifers to basalt's influence on climate. Could you give us a glimpse into this architecture?
So rocks are, in a way, the built environment in which we live. So maybe the aquifer example is a good place to start, that most groundwater is housed in rocks. Sometimes it's just loose sediment, but in most places, it's actually strata or different rock units that were formed long ago in some other setting, but today are the place where rainwater seeps down and then finds a rock unit that is permeable enough to transport that water some distance. In that sense, rocks are, again, really responsive. They're interacting with modern rain and they're providing this service to us of plentiful, long-lived water reservoirs. Over longer periods of time, interactions between rocks like basalt, which was the one I mentioned at the outset, which is the most common rock type on the planet. It's the black lava of Hawaii and Iceland and underlies the world's oceans. When it's exposed to the air, slowly over time, it absorbs carbon dioxide and helps in the long term modulate climate by removing that carbon dioxide and fixing it in mineral form. Some ideas about carbon sequestration strategies are inspired by that background geologic process, and I think they're laudable efforts. There's nothing dangerous about them. They're just probably not going to be the panacea or the silver bullet solution we need to the climate problem, but we can look to nature and that kind of interaction between rocks and the atmosphere as inspiration for how we can try to fix this climate predicament we've created for ourselves. So, yeah, I hope that those provide some examples.
Yes, absolutely. And it also underscores why it's so important that we remember we are earthlings and that this is a living, breathing system that has given us so much. And really hope that we may be able to move from this anthropocentric to a geocentric worldview, as you also advocate for. And I'd like to know, Marcia, you've spent so much of your life in deep conversation with the earth. Have you also shared conversations with indigenous knowledge holders, particularly around rocks, land, and our living planet?
Yeah, I have. Here in Wisconsin, I've been involved with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is a consortium of the 11 different tribes, Ojibwe tribes in the Great Lakes region, especially centered around Lake Superior. So in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And these tribes share hunting and fishing rights in what's called the ceded territories, which were signed away to the US government under duress, of course, in the 1850s, but the tribes were granted perpetual rights to hunt and fish outside their reservations on these ceded territories that include much of northeastern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and almost all of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a vast area. So the tribes have gotten together and pooled their resources to get really good legal representation to enforce their hunting and fishing rights. And unfortunately, there have been several major mining projects that have threatened the waters of this region. And so I've worked with the tribes on a couple of occasions and some of the tribal scientists to articulate both the sort of indigenous understanding of the land and the ecosystems, as well as the kind of Western scientific perspective. And what's really interesting is that I think more and more those are converging in many ways. We may use different language, but conceptually, we've come to the same kinds of conclusions about the interconnectivity between rocks and water and life forms. So that's been my main experience, is trying to create a compelling legal argument based on the synthesis of those two worldviews has been really interesting.
Yes, and that's fascinating. And I'm glad you have that type of collaboration and connection. I have, on a few occasions in my life, had the privilege to connect with different indigenous elders and wisdom keepers, and from all across the globe, actually. And it has always struck me in such a beautiful way that they all spoke about the earth as kin, the tree as kin, the rock as kin, the river as kin. And yeah, I sense that that's also something that comes across in your work, Marcia. And you have said that thinking like a geologist might actually help save our world. What do you mean by that? And what are some practical or philosophical ways to actually shift in how we approach this planetary crisis?
Right. And by the world, I don't mean the earth, the world as humans know it. And so I don't love the subtitle. That was the subtitle of Timefulness, was actually suggested by the publisher. But I do think that a shift to a geological worldview could be a really powerful one for both practical and spiritual reasons. So maybe I'll start with the practical would be just getting realistic again about the idea that the earth's in charge. We need to understand how it functions and adapt our behavior accordingly. Spiritually, maybe even more importantly at this point, I think what we need is a cultural revolution. But spiritually, I think our problem is individual and collective narcissism. Certainly at the individual level, social media is preying on our evolutionary psychology, and that's your area, in dangerous ways. But I think collective human narcissism is part of the problem too. We need to stop thinking it's all about us, because that's making us sick collectively. We're lonely. We don't remember who we are. We think we're isolated on this temporal plane, that we're different from all previous human generations because of the technologies that are occupying our brains all the time. We're not really all that different from earlier people. And if we could understand that, we'd be happier. And likewise, we're we share the status as Earthlings with all other living beings on Earth. If we just could see that we're part of this continuum of life that's been going on for almost 4 billion years, it would make us happier. Instead, we're always so obsessed with being exceptional and being the central focus of everything. If we would just let go of that narcissism, we'd be much happier and the world would be a better place.
I could not
A
agree.
naive view, but yeah.
I don't think it's naive at all, Marcia. I could not agree more. You're speaking my language. And for me, I move in the worlds of health and wellness and biohacking and self-optimization. For me, that has always been deeply connected with the larger human family and then also our mother, the earth. Because what good is it if you whatever, keep optimizing whatever yourself, and then you live in a community that's not a community anymore because everybody's so disconnected from everyone else. And you live on a planet where for your species, it's become uninhabitable, right? So this has always been also core of my mission. And that's why I also believe voices like yours are so important. And it's so important to listen and to have these discussions. We touched upon something a little bit earlier. There's an ongoing interest in the colonization of Mars. And as somebody who's so deeply connected to Earth, you've already let it shine through before, but what are your thoughts on this?
Mars is a cold and terrible place. I'm interested in it as a scientist. In fact, in the last semester, I taught a course about Mars. And it's fascinating. We know a lot about Mars. We actually know the topography of Mars in more detail than we know the topography of Earth because we have oceans on Earth that obscure Mars. And what we know about Mars is it's started out a planet with water, but there's been no water there for 3 or more billion years. It's got no oxygen because it never had any photosynthetic organisms. Any notion that somehow we could jolt it back to life in any kind of human time frame. By the way, it also doesn't have a magnetic field, so the solar cosmic radiation and the solar wind are just ferocious. And the dust storms would probably kill people, apart from the fact that they'd always have to have masks on because there's no oxygen. It's a complete delusion that somehow we could technologically will that planet into anything like a habitable place. And the illogic where the climate is going to be so terrible on Earth, there's nothing we can do, but we can go to this other planet and control it. It hurts my head. And some of the ideas about how you might get Mars to be habitable are one-off things. They're not sustainable. It stems from a complete lack of respect for the biogeochemical habits, the culture of Earth, essentially. It's not just about creating a circumstance. It's about you have to have interacting parts that then self-maintain for long periods of time. And just the hubris of it is breathtaking to me. And what's sad is that it's really getting traction in the minds of ordinary people, causing us to think when Earth gets so bad, we'll just go to.
Yeah, that's also what bothers me. So why would we want to continue trashing this place so it becomes uninhabitable for us and then go to the next? The mindset alone is so disturbing to me. And the second thing is we're not there yet. If you look at the Kardashev scale, we are not a type of civilization. We can't even harness the energy of our planet, of our solar system in a way that is non-destructive.
And I think the more important lesson is we can't even control ourselves.
Yeah.
We're always looking to technology as the solution when we have to look back at ourselves. What is the problem with us and our will? Yeah, we think it's easier to manipulate a planet than it is to actually change our own human behaviors.
Yeah. Yes, it also strikes me as just ridiculous in so many ways. And that word that you used, hubris. Yes. If you could place a message for the seventh generation after ours inside a stone vault in Svalbard, Norway, a message from the earth and yourself, what would it say?
I think it might be an apology for our generation and our short-sightedness. But I remain optimistic. I think that we are resilient creatures. And there's a growing recognition that we can't just keep hurtling forward without thinking about how the next technology is going to ripple through social and cultural systems. I feel like maybe we're getting a little more wisdom about just embracing the next new shiny thing. And yeah, maybe we'll find our way. I hope that through my writing, I can share the joy of just a direct and personal connection with the things that really last. That's what I try to do. And I guess that would be my message to any future people too, that the earth abides and will care for us if we listen to it.
Yes, and I think you succeed, Marcia. And I also do share, I share the grief and I also share the optimism. And as a closing reflection for this conversation, what if the earth is not only our home, but our elder, not only our environment, but our relative, our ancestor, our mirror? And in today's conversation, we were reminded that stone is not just stillness, it's story. Mountain, every pebble, every layer of rock holds the memory of transformation, pressure, heat, shadow, reformation, and endurance not as stubbornness, but as evolution. And through Marcia's words, we are invited to slow down and listen differently, to trade urgency for patience and noise for witnessing, and isolation for kinship. And I hope, listeners, that this episode leaves you with a sense of rooted awe. And may you remember that you walk not on dead matter, but on the skin of a planet that breathes, creates, weeps, and celebrates, and that you too are made of dust and stardust, and that within you also lives the same story that Earth tells, one of rupture, one of resilience, one of memory, and one of becoming. Thank you, Marcia, for this incredible conversation. And for those who would like to reach out to you, connect with you, learn more about you, how can they do so?
I'm not on social media.
I noticed.
But I'm relatively easy to find. I have a strange Norwegian name. And so I think probably people can find my books. And please look for them at your libraries and independent booksellers.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure to include all of that in the show notes as well. Marcia, again, thank you so much for making time for us today.
It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Ariana.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.